Hi there, and welcome to our Connected Conservation webinar today featuring the Sierra Foothill Conservancy. My name is Cass Bismeyer, and I am one of the community leaders for our Connected Conservation Community of Practice for the National Park Service. Our group is an interdisciplinary team that stretches across our agency, made up of different program areas as well as park units. And our team's goal or mission is to work across boundaries to conduct the work that we need to get done. So a few years ago, we put together our monthly webinar series. Many of you have probably tuned in over time, where we're featuring at least one or two webinars a month that are focused on tools that enable parks and programs to work beyond boundaries. For the first half of this year, we've been focused on best practices or projects that have been focused outside of national parks and gateway communities. And we're really grateful today to have Bridget Fithian, who's the Executive Director from the Sierra Foothill Conservancy, to talk to us a little bit about her work outside of Yosemite National Park and the Sierra Foothills. So just a little bit about Bridget, and then we'll go ahead and turn it over to her. And one item on housekeeping throughout the presentation today, feel free to plug in some questions, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A at the end. Everyone will stay muted for the duration of the presentation, and we'll read aloud your questions for Bridget to answer. So again, welcome to Bridget Fithian, the Executive Director for the Sierra Foothill Conservancy. She has been with the Conservancy for the last 10 years, and in 2015 was selected as the Executive Director. Since taking over, she has doubled the operating budget of the Sierra Foothill Conservancy and expanded land acquisition and engagement programming. She oversees over 30,000 acres of conserved land, specializing in creative solutions to achieve conservation goals and working landscape conservation. Bridget, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you at this point. Thanks again on behalf of the National Park Service for joining us and sharing all the good work that you've been doing in the Sierra Foothills.
Great. Thank you, Cass, and thanks everyone for joining us today, and appreciate the opportunity to share with you. And also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all the good work of everyone who is tuning in to this broadcast, and everything that each of you are doing for conservation across the spectrum, and also doing it in really difficult conditions. So some of you may be at home with kids trying to work, some of you may be cooped up in apartments, and it's just a really different and difficult context to work in. So thanks everyone for the work that you're doing, and especially during this time when there's so many more pressures on us all. So today we're going to discuss as Cass mentioned, the land conservation work that Sierra Foothill Conservancy is doing. We're going to focus on the working land conservation and the community conservation projects and context for Sierra Foothill Conservancy. And as Cass mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of SFC, and I also serve as the Board President for our regional association, the Sierra Cascades Land Trust Council, and I serve on the Board of Directors of the California Council of Land Trusts, which is our statewide organization. Now I'm going to try to advance the slide, see if it works. Aha! Okay. So this is the outline of the presentation for today. So I'm going to start with providing some context of the land conservation community and the land trust work. And then we're going to dive into looking under the hood of land conservation and the strategies that we employ to achieve our goals. And then we'll focus in on the spectrum of land conservation projects, and specifically our working land conservation and our community conservation projects. And all of this will also include discussion around the evolving role of land trusts and conservation in a time of change. And this includes, a time of change with the climate. This includes a time of change in the context of society and social and cultural dynamics, and just how we think about conservation and what our role is in ensuring that the lands that we're conserving will be conserved in perpetuity and that people will be connected to that work. So this map shows you the area of the Sierra Nevada that the land trusts are working to serve. The Sierra Cascade Land Trust Council is made up of over 20 partner land trusts, and for folks who are within the state of California, you may be familiar with the work of many of these organizations throughout the region. Some of them are statewide, some of them are focused on specific geographies, and some of them are nationwide serving. So I understand that the Trust for Public Land periodically provides presentations to this group as well. And they're an excellent partner that helps with many of our local land trusts to facilitate our transactions and help us meet our goals. We recently completed a census of the land trusts that are working in the Sierra, and to date, we've conserved collectively over 932,000 acres of land. And on deck, we have over 378,000 acres of land that are identified for conservation. So those are projects, acres, properties that the land trusts are currently working to develop, fund, complete. So you can see that there's a big footprint that the private land conservation sector is working on just outside of the boundaries or sometimes inside of the boundaries of the federal lands. This is Sierra Foothill Conservancy's service area map, and so this gives you the context of the region and the geography that we're working to serve. To the north, you can see the anchor of Yosemite National Park, and to the south, the anchor of Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks. We are working to build connected corridors from the grasslands, which is the lower section of that map, up to the Sierra Crest. So Sierra Foothill Conservancy can complete work on, assist with projects throughout this entire region. And you can see the accomplishments of the work that we've been completing over the last 24 years. So the small red dots here that have the little CE inside of them, those are conservation easement projects. Those are partnerships with private landowners, and many of them are working lands. So by working lands, we mean there's a rangeland or a cattle operation, or there may be a timber operation that is taking place on those properties and is married with the conservation goals that Sierra Foothill Conservancy and partners are working to achieve. The conservation easement is a permanent land conservation tool. So that promise of perpetuity that we are working to uphold is baked into the commitment of the conservation easement between that landowner and any successive landowners when they pass on or sell their property or it's inherited, will continue. That conservation will continue to the next generation. The other type of conservation that we primarily utilize is establishing preserves. And so the preserves are properties that Sierra Foothill Conservancy owns in fee title and operates. And to the north, you can see our Bean Creek Preserve. This is a low elevation mountain meadow property that has actually been degraded over time from surrounding uses, and we've been implementing a meadow restoration project in partnership with other organizations in a cohort that is working across the Sierra to restore meadows, their hydrology, and all of the services that they provide to wildlife and water resources. Next down is our Feliciana Mountain Preserve, and that is specifically focused on protecting an endangered species that's endemic to this area. So the limestone salamander actually only occurs in the Merced River Canyon and then in a couple of isolated populations within Yosemite National Park. So you can see that connectivity of species preservation that we're working on in the context of the park and the supporting populations that are outside of the park. Moving down is our Stockton Creek Preserve. We're going to highlight that in this presentation. It is a community conservation project that's focused on providing connections for people to conservation and serving the community in a variety of ways. And then as we move south, you see the focus area of the San Joaquin River. So where you see the Feingold Creek Preserve, the McKenzie Table Mountain Preserve, and all of those little conservation easements, that is our San Joaquin River focus area. It's been one of the sections where we've completed a great majority of the work of the organization. And the McKenzie Table Mountain Preserve is very close to Fresno. So this is one of the ways that we connect the community and the urban population to conservation is through experiences on our Table Mountain Preserve, hiking, youth programming, and it's a beloved space for these communities. Moving south, you can see some of the other preserves that we hold, including the southern section, which is the Kings River and includes our Tybee Mountain Preserve. And that preserve specifically protects a population of Keck's checker bloom, which is the only known remaining population of that flower. So it's a relative of the farewell to spring, if you're familiar with that, and you know, we have the opportunity to protect and steward the last population that's known for that species. So lots of important things happening throughout this whole region, and lots of wonderful partners that are also helping to make all of this happen. This is Sierra Foothill Conservancy's impact report. So in the last year, we've added almost 9,000 acres to our conserved lands portfolio. We've protected 36 miles of streams in just this last year. We've been restoring habitats, and we've planted over 3,600 native plants throughout our preserves and in our partnerships with our private landowners. And we've been connecting people significantly to the work. So 2,400 students participated in our youth education programs. The majority of those students came from underserved populations, urban populations, particularly focused on providing services to the city of Fresno, which has one of the least amounts of parks and public open spaces per capita throughout the entire United States. So there's a really incredible need to, you know, provide connection for young people to the outdoors, and that's something FFC is working on. And over 5,000 people enjoyed our programs, our hikes, our trail runs, and various programming out on the properties. And we currently have a membership of 2,700 members. So we've protected 41,810 acres thus far that provides lots of habitat for species and spaces for people to connect to nature. And we're looking at another big year. So another 11,566 acres on deck to conserve in this next year. As I mentioned in the introduction, we have a spectrum of land conservation projects. So the kind of three big buckets that they can be grouped in are the community conservation projects, which really has a focus of how people connect to land, how people connect to nature, and what we can do to try to build more connection. The next bucket is habitat and resource conservation, which is focused on specific species or habitats like that checker bloom that I mentioned, less known population, or the Feliciana Mountain Preserve, which is one of a very limited set of populations for endangered species. And then we have our working land conservation, which has a primary goal of conserving working land, but also comes with a whole host of benefits in association with those working lands. So today we're going to talk more about the working land conservation and the community conservation projects. Our strategy to building connected corridors of conservation is what you can see taking place in this map. So from the grasslands to the Sierra Crest, we're trying to build these connected landscapes, and oftentimes what you'll see is that protected lands will sort of end at the edge of the higher elevation Sierra, and then we have this really rich set of ecosystems and habitats that expand down towards the Central Valley, including oak woodlands and our grasslands, where some of our most endangered and threatened species reside. So the work that Sierra Foothill Conservancy is doing to build these connected corridors is providing preservation for those species and connectivity for adaptation. And predominantly, we are working with private landowners in this landscape, and those landowners tend to be the ranching community. So in the last 24 years, we've built some really wonderful partnerships with those ranching families. Many of them are multi-generation, and they're really helping to realize this vision of expanding conservation from that federal landscape down through the private lands and into the Central Valley. So, sometimes folks have a hard time thinking about, how do cows and conservation work together? Strange bedfellows, eh? So over the last couple decades, there's been a lot of research about grazing and grazing management and working lands and how that commingles with ecological benefits. Sierra Foothill Conservancy, we actually have our own herd of cattle that we run on our properties, and we conduct ecologically based grazing management on our properties. And what's really interesting is that we actually need grazing or some form of management in these landscapes in order to retain the biodiversity of them. So this next slide shows images of our Kennedy Table Topping Ranch conservation easement. This is up on top of those table mountains that I had mentioned previously. And this is a volcanic table that is a host to an incredible diversity of species. There are vernal pools here. There are wildflowers that only exist in these landscapes. And what we have found is that if we remove grazing from these landscapes, we actually lose the diversity of these species. So the grasslands of California are very different than they were pre-European times. So basically, when European settlement started occurring, Europeans also brought various species with them to support the cattle that they were bringing and to support the foods that they were growing. And those have become part of the landscape, but are non-native. So our non-native annual grassland species, if they are left unmanaged, they will essentially build up a thatch of dead grass in these landscapes that then becomes impenetrable to the small species that utilize these lands, and also impenetrable to these beautiful little wildflowers that try to pop up in the springtime. So we use grazing as a management tool. And the other thing that has been really interesting is that our landowners actually tend to be very attuned to the rhythm of these systems and the rhythm of the landscape. And just through, minor tweaking to their grazing operations, we're able to really expand the diversity of these species. On the right-hand side is one of our landowners who's just been an incredible partner, and together with Bart Topping and his family, we have conserved over 2,500 acres in that San Joaquin River corridor that I mentioned. The next corridor that we wanted to share about is the Merced River corridor. So the Merced River flows through Yosemite Valley. Its headwaters are located in Yosemite National Park, and flows down through the Sierra Foothills and into the Central Valley, and is an incredible resource for wildlife and water resources that are utilized by humans and species alike. So again, you can see in this matrix, to the north, we have our federal lands, we have our national park, we have our BLM and our Forest Service. And then as we get down into the oak woodland and the grassland region, we don't have conservation. So Sierra Foothill Conservancy has been working to fill the gap and provide conservation for the species that inhabit this region, and the resources that are so vital to our ecosystems. Down to the south, the red section is the city of Merced, and the other brown land masses are associated with the UC Merced and the conservation that they were required to implement when they were starting to build their campus. So the green parcels and the pink parcel, those are projects that we've been focused on for a number of years, working to conserve those lands. These are all ranches also. So we recently, just a couple weeks ago, we closed the, just toggling back here, this pink Hornitos Ranch that's highlighted. We closed that transaction through a conservation easement, and that in one transaction can serve 7,000 acres. So it's very significant. The habitats range from vernal pools down at the end of the property. I'll go back to the map here. What we call the boot, which is the south end of the property, is vernal pools. And then this has an incredible gradient of elevation and habitat types. We move from vernal pools up to the oak savanna and up into the denser oak woodlands just in this one property type, and taking in some very significant expanses of stream and watershed that is flowing into the Merced River. So we're pretty excited about this project, and it is a partnership, again, with a ranching family and a very historic point of interest as well. It's the historic Gagliardo Ranch, which is a gold rush era family that were merchants. So lots of rich history and just wonderful habitat on this property, and we're really excited to celebrate the success and partnership with our ranching partner. This giant list shows you many of the plans and strategies that conservation of the Hornitos Ranch helps to implement. So, one of the ways that we can think of the work that land trusts are doing is that we're actually helping to implement the strategies and the goals and objectives that our federal, state, and local partners have identified. So CAL FIRE has identified strategies, and we're helping to implement those. USDA has identified strategies for conservation, and we're helping to implement those. Conservation and recovery of species for our agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So when we do these really large-scale rangeland conservation projects, they serve a multitude of goals and just help to implement the vision that all of our partners are strategizing on. This graph also shows the percentage of acreage for various plans and strategies that the property also helps to implement. So we have our state Department of Fish and Wildlife strategies and goals, our U.S. Fish and Wildlife strategies and goals, and then our regional conservancy, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, also represented in this graphic. Jumping over to another subject, we're going to move into the community conservation portion of the presentation. And this is sort of on the other end of the spectrum from the rangeland and habitat conservation typically, because at the core of this, we have that goal of connecting people to conservation, connecting community to conservation, and providing conservation outcomes that are going to make impacts in helping to address community issues. So we started asking ourselves some different questions. What are the needs of the community? How can conservation help serve those needs? What does that mean to the evolution of how we approach our work? And what partners do we need in order to achieve those goals? So it's really changed the way that we think about our work and how we approach our work and what some of the elements are with our work. So the context of the Mariposa Creek Parkway, it includes fuels management, it includes housing, and it includes economic development as well as the more traditional recreation and conservation goals and outcomes that our land trust would typically implement. This space also provides an alternative recreation asset for the community of Mariposa that is a gateway community to Yosemite National Park. So as we all know, our national parks, especially the large ones like Yosemite, are very over-impacted by visitor use. And our gateway communities can provide additional assets to help alleviate some of the burden that those parks are really shouldering. So we see this as both an asset for the community and an asset for the visitors who are, staying in Mariposa when they're visiting Yosemite and looking for some recreation that's located adjacent to their hotels or in the community that they're staying. It's also an asset that's going to help build the community identity for Mariposa. Gateway communities oftentimes can struggle with how they balance nature and commerce. There's a really great book, Balancing Nature and Commerce in Gateway Communities. And this is an example of a project that will create a recreation space that highlights the natural resources in the landscape and creates an incredible recreation opportunity that preserves the land and provides connection for tourists and attraction for tourists. So the larger context of this region includes the Mariposa Creek Parkway, this connected network of trails that is envisioned. And to the north end of this graphic, you can see the Stockton Creek Preserve, which is another property that Sierra Foothill and partners have conserved together that we're going to discuss. And you can see the arrow pointing towards Yosemite National Park and the Merced River and the Merced River Trail. So the Land Trust is able to partner with the county to build this vision for recreation in our region, this vision for conservation in our region, and what the community is going to look like in the next decade as we grow and expand and work to build an economy that is more sustainable and not as affected by the boom and bust cycles of visitors to Yosemite National Park and the boom and bust cycles that we're experiencing more and more as we have more natural disasters, fires, rock slides that shut down Yosemite really create a very difficult economic situation for these gateway communities that are dependent upon the tourism dollars. But if we can cultivate assets and recreation opportunities in our gateway communities that will attract and retain folks to visit this place for what it is, we can help to alleviate some of that boom and bust. This is a zoom in on the Mariposa Creek Parkway, and all of these documents that I'm sharing right now, these maps and images, are baked into the Mariposa Creek Parkway Master Plan, which was recently adopted by the County of Mariposa, and Sierra Foothill Conservancy has been a partner to this. So the yellow properties in the center of the graphic are the lands that Sierra Foothill is working on acquiring and then transferring to Mariposa County for the Creek Parkway. The two properties that are on the right-hand side of this, if you can see the little tiny bubbles, one says Holbert and one says Fisk, I was just sharing this with Cass, we're just about to close those acquisitions. So over the last year and a half, Sierra Foothill Conservancy has been applying for grants for the purchase of those properties, and we were awarded the funding from the California Natural Resources Agency. And in just about a month or so, we will close the escrow on those and then be able to transfer them to Mariposa County. And then we will begin building the trail networks and recruiting the resources to implement the vision that we've put together in the master plan. So we're very excited about this. And you can also see how close this is in the context of the community of Mariposa. So this will be utilized as an asset for the community for recreation, exercise, and also conserve these habitats. And then we will be implementing fuels management projects here too. So that's something that we've been experiencing more and more in the region is catastrophic fire. And when we look at that from a conservation perspective, we want the lands we've conserved to be resilient through fire events. Fire is a natural element of the ecosystem, but due to the legacy of fire suppression, we have a fuels load, and due to the impacts of climate change and drought, we are having these catastrophic fires, and we have to start thinking about and implementing alternative management tools in our landscape. So when we implement a fuels management project in this landscape, it will help make it more resilient in fire events so that fire can function more naturally in this landscape. And it will also help to protect the community of Mariposa. And this is, one of the new ways that we're thinking about the work that the Land Trust can do and the services that the Land Trust can provide to the community that are going to help build that investment that we need people to have in the work of conservation, whether that's in supporting and protecting our national parks or supporting and protecting our private land conservation in perpetuity. Diving in closer, this is the parcel that was furthest to the left in the last graphic, called the Fremer property. And within this parcel, we will actually be, the county and partners will be implementing housing. So again, this is something that we commonly think of as the antithesis of conservation, right? It's like literally the opposite and the thing that we're often trying to prevent. But in California and in Mariposa and in many places, there is actually a crisis around housing, and there is an incredible lack of housing, and there's really a major lack of affordable housing. So within this conservation project, we're actually going to create a conserved landscape, a recreation landscape, and a restored landscape that people are connected to. They can walk out of their apartment and go for a bike ride, go for a hike, get out in nature, touch and feel it, and not have it be something that is separate and away from them, but something that is part of their daily experience. So we call this bringing conservation to the people, or bringing the nature to the people. So oftentimes the people are traveling to go to the conservation, and we're trying to get them there. And that might mean we're busing kids from, an urban area to get out to the preserve, or folks are driving to hike on the preserve. And when we do these community conservation projects, the conservation and the nature is connected and integrated into their communities. As we think about upholding that promise of perpetuity and how we make conservation work relevant to current and future generations, we believe that this is going to be more and more critical, that we meet people where they are, and we don't put so much burden of expectation for people to interact with nature and recreate and interact with conservation in the constructs that we manage and control, but that we create the space for them to be able to access nature in the way that that they can envision. The other project that I mentioned is the Stockton Creek Preserve, and our big vision is to connect what I was just sharing with you, the Creek Parkway, to the Stockton Creek Preserve. This project was a partnership with the Mariposa Public Utility District, and again, integrates fuels management practices, a restoration and vegetation management practice with recreation and watershed conservation. So the body of water that you see at the center of the preserve is the Stockton Creek Reservoir. That provides all of the domestic water for the community of Mariposa. So with this preserve, we're protecting the town's water resource, and we are building a more resilient landscape around it. One of the impetus for the creation of this project was, again, the element of fire. So we had an arson that was starting fires throughout Mariposa in and he lit a fire near this property, which was not protected at the time. It was private land, and it really nuked the whole landscape. So this was an overgrown chaparral plant community that hadn't burned in, more than 80 years because of fire suppression and its proximity to the town. So when the fire burned this landscape, it just really, it burned hot, and it killed everything in sight, basically. And then we had a really great rain year. So we had incredible precipitation, which then washed all of that ash and particulate matter into the reservoir. So the public utility district was in a very difficult situation trying to meet the regulations and standards of clean water, and were unable to meet it. So they were being fined and charged for continuing to provide this water to the community, and it was all as a result of that particulate matter and the fire in the landscape, and this unmanaged landscape that had not had fire in it, creating this major particulate event into the town's water resource. So interesting event that made the public utility district understand the value of conserving the land and also managing the land so that they could prevent that type of event from happening in the future. So we partnered with them to establish the first section of the preserve, which is what you see in green here. And we built in a major recreation goal. So we've established over 3 miles of trails on the property with partners, including the Conservation Corps and many funders from the state level as well as the federal level. And we actually this year added an additional 320 acres that links the northern green piece to the southern green piece that you see the trailhead facility to the south. So our goal is to continue to conserve adjacent lands and expand the preserve and expand the recreation opportunities for the community, as well as the visitors who are coming and staying in Mariposa and looking for recreation and opportunities to get out. This gives some of the context for the type of recreation that's taking place on the property, and also some of the restoration efforts. So the picture that's down here in the center profile was a part of the restoration that we've been doing on the property to reestablish the oaks that were lost on the property during the burn. And both Cass and my children have participated in planting conifers and baby acorns on this property to help reestablish those trees as we're stewarding the landscape. This is an image of the new section of acquisition, the expansion of that 320 acres that I had mentioned. And you can see there's a very dense fuel load in this area as well. We plan to implement additional phases of fuels management and vegetation management and restoration throughout this section as well. To the right, you see a list of some of the partners for this project. It's it's incredible the diversity of partners that we can bring in to community conservation projects when we just start asking ourselves questions, and we start asking our community questions about what is needed and what they would like to see in their community. So we even have, CAL FIRE and the Sheriff Department are big supporters of this property, and they do physical training out on the preserve, and that's integrated into some of their practices with their deputies. So, there's just such a huge potential for having conservation connect to so many different sectors of our communities. And if we want to be sustainable in our work long term, we're going to have to think about the work that we do differently and think about how we can provide those services to a greater cross-section of our communities. So, guess that species. I know you can't because you're on mute, but it's the western pond turtle, and it's very cute. And this is a project that Sierra Foothill Conservancy was able to complete with Yosemite National Park and the Wildlife Branch. So in Yosemite Valley, the western pond turtle has been extirpated, has no longer existed in that landscape for a fairly extended period of time due to predation, predominantly, I believe. And so the Wildlife Branch of Yosemite National Park ended up taking on a project to reestablish the western pond turtle in Yosemite Valley. So the crux was they didn't have any turtles to bring to Yosemite because there were no turtles in Yosemite anymore. And so I think this is a really great example of the types of partnerships that can be developed between the parks and the outlying conservation organizations, the communities that are outside of the boundaries of the park, but really represents the interdependency between the two. So oftentimes we think of the gateway communities as dependent upon the park, but this is an example of a project that demonstrates how the park is dependent upon the gateway communities and the ecosystems that are adjacent and outside of their boundaries as well. So you can see here some of the wonderful folks from Yosemite National Park that work so hard on this Western Pond Turtle project. They are on site at the Stockton Creek Preserve that we were discussing. And when the park staff originally contacted me and said that they wanted some of our turtles, I was like, wait a minute, do we have enough turtles to spare? And they had, of course, thought through that very thoroughly, and they did a study, which you see taking place here, to evaluate the population that is on site at the Stockton Creek Preserve and the robustness of the population, the health of the population, and made the determination that it would be okay to remove several of these individuals in order to do a captive breeding program with the San Francisco Zoo. So some of these turtles that you see here became city turtles and went to the big city and participated in a breeding program and created little baby turtles that when they got big enough were released in Yosemite and released back to the Stockton Creek Preserve and other sites outside of the park's boundaries. So we love this project and this partnership, and it was all conceptualized by the staff. And I think that that's another really poignant element of the work that we can do across sectors, across boundaries, is that oftentimes some of the best ideas are coming out of the field staff, are coming out of, folks that might not necessarily be identified to lead these sort of initiatives. And I think that, one of the staff was hiking on the Stockton Creek Preserve and saw the turtles and said, hey, let's contact SFC and see if they want to partner with us. So shout out to the Wildlife Branch and all of their good work that they're doing in Yosemite and for these adorable little turtles. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. And again, I want to thank everyone and provide my contact information. So if you'd like to contact me directly, as well as the website for Sierra Foothill Conservancy. And then I will turn it back to Cass to see if there's any questions that folks have.
Great. Thanks so much, Bridget. Yes, and if you do have questions, go ahead and plug them into our chat box there. We'll read them aloud as they come in. Bridget, what an amazing complexity of work that you're working on in this year. Everything from protecting land and going through easements to doing intricate work with restoring a species to a national park. How awesome. I have a quick question to start us off. And
Great.
Congratulations on all the success that you've had, certainly recently, but over the last 20 plus years with the Conservancy. So with projects like the easements with the ranching land, you said that that ends up being in perpetuity. Is that something where you you all are looking for those ranch lands actively and approaching those people on sort of a one-on-one basis, and developing the relationships from there, or do you approach like a larger ranching council or something like that and just say, hey, we're interested in providing this connectivity opportunity? Is it typically a one-on-one thing, or you're approaching a larger group?
It is, it is a good question, and it is a kind of a combination of those things. We don't actively solicit landowners for participation, but we build relationships. So just like many things that happen in the professional setting, it starts with relationship building and trust building. So that's very important dynamic of establishing those relationships, is establishing trust with landowners who may be suspect of conservation and maybe suspect of quote unquote government activities, and there is a great hesitancy in the private landowning community to participate in some of these programs. So typically what is happening is we're building relationships through neighboring landowners. We're building relationships through participating in programming that is important to the ranching community. So there's a number of associations that we're part of. We're part of the Cattlemen's Association, and then at the local level, we're part of the cattle women's groups and the cattlemen's groups that serve the local geographies. And I think one of the points of success to building relationships in the ranching community is to become part of that community. So participate in their fundraisers, learn about what their needs and concerns are, and just build relationship and connection. And then from that, we are able to build that connection to conservation and, bridge the gap and build that shared value to conserve lands. So typically what happens is landowners approach us, and so they will have learned about the work of SFC either through, the engagements that we're doing in the ranching community or through their neighbor who may have an easement. So the Topping Ranch that I mentioned, Bart Topping, that landowner has probably been responsible for bringing in maybe 8,000 additional acres of land conservation just by sharing about the work with SFC and his experience with his neighboring landowners. So, it's I think the ranching community has a lot of word of mouth and oral tradition that is a big part of it. And so that's, one of the primary ways is just kind of person to person.
Great. Another question here. I can see that you are on the you said you're on the California Council for Land Trusts. Are other trusts around the state or around the country utilizing some creative thinking around conservation like you are, such as what you're doing with the Mariposa Creek Parkway and thinking about low-income housing as an avenue to reach conservation? Are other land trusts thinking in the same direction?
I think that, I know that some are and some aren't. So, some land, there's a really broad spectrum of the way that land trusts implement their goals and their missions. And so, you look at like the California Rangeland Trust, and they only do conservation easements, so they don't own preserves, and they only do conservation easements on working land, so only on ranches, right? So they're really specific. They're very effective because they're very targeted. So they've conserved over 300,000 acres of land in, I think, just 15 years or something like that. So, that's an example of like a very focused land trust. But there's other land trusts, like one in Tennessee, that they are actually leading the development. So they are taking the lead position to design communities and design housing, and then also design, what conservation gets implemented and how the land is used. So they will, purchase or with partners acquire a property, and then they will do a plan and design for that property that integrates housing and recreation and conservation. So they've fully flipped the model on its head to say, we are going to drive where the development happens and where it doesn't happen, and be in the, total driver's seat. So, there's definitely a big spectrum to how land trusts are working to address these issues, or not at all. And of course, there's variation as well between, more urban setting land trusts and more rural land trusts. And so, for instance, also like the Big Sur Land Trust, they've basically like protected all the land they can protect on the Big Sur coast of California. And their community is saying to them, we want you to focus on other community needs. So they are also exploring how they can assist with the housing crisis, and particularly the affordable housing crisis, and farm workers and the migrant workers who are, in the Salinas Valley, growing so much food for the state and for the country, and don't have anywhere to live. So we are seeing land trust missions kind of morph, and seeing some of them taking on, some of these other community needs.
Yeah, that's great. Another question here, does SFC regularly work or coordinate with the staff at Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, since you're kind of settled in between there?
Yeah, so like the Western Pond Turtle Project, that's a really good example of coordination with the staff in Yosemite, and we have had some other engagement with regards to like the Gateway Partners, which is a group that Yosemite hosts and focuses on, the Gateway communities and their context with the Park Service. We've had some involvement with that, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity for more engagement and connection, and I look forward to that, with working with the staff at Yosemite and working with the staff at Sequoia and Kings Canyon. We've had less involvement with Sequoia and Kings Canyon, probably because we're further away from that. We do have an office in Prather, but that's eastern Fresno County, and still quite a bit off from those parks. So the other thing is that the Park Service frequently provides, letters of support and, that sort of supporting effort to the work that Sierra Foothill is doing. So when we're applying for grants, oftentimes staff at the park will provide letters of support, which is really helpful, and recognizing, how we have that support of each other and that common goal of conservation. But I do think there's a lot more opportunity for collaboration, and more opportunity for us to understand what the goals are for the Park Service, and in ways that Sierra Foothill and the Land Trust community can help.
Great. Well, it looks like those are the questions that we have for today. Bridget, thank you again for an excellent presentation, and congratulations again on all the successes that you've had in protecting land and species and working with the community. It's truly impressive to see everything laid out and so diverse. Like, what a job. For those of you who follow our series, just a nod to the next presentation that we have. We have multiple in August. I did plug in 2 links that you can access. One is a brand new website that the Connected Conservation Community has put forth on nps.gov. And you can find all of our past webinars recordings on that site, as well as register for future webinars. And then the second link that I plugged into the chat there will take you to our internal site that has a whole lot of resources for those of you within the department that are working on cross-boundary work Our next two webinars, or actually three webinars, are going to have a tribal focus. So our next one is August 5th, which will be partnering with tribes on conservation. And we'll be hearing from our National Park Service office, or from our Washington office on that. And then on August 12th, we'll have a feature on restoring wild bison to the crown of the continent, which will feature Glacier National Park. And then we'll round out that mini series on tribal engagement on September 2nd with a feature on tribal tourism and park conservation. So quite a few left for the remainder of this year. If you ever have an idea for a topic that you want to hear more about, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to explore it and try to get it on our calendar. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in. Bridget, best regards, and good luck in your work.
Thank you so much, Cass. And thanks, everyone.